Discussions on the nature of UFOs remain extremely polarized between those who support the extraterrestrial theory and those who oppose it. This polarization is putting up a wall in debates and preventing the examination of further possibilities. In 1997, at the invitation of American billionaire Lawrence Rockefeller, well-known scientists gathered in Pocantico, New Jersey, to discuss UFOs. It was the first time since 1969, when the Air Force dropped its investigation into the matter, that a panel of scientists had gotten together to discuss UFOs. Led by astrophysicist Peter Sturrock, these discussions brought the strange sightings to the academic forefront. Mark Roediger and John Schuessler were among the scientists invited to the meeting.
The purpose of the meeting, it was designed by Peter Sturrock to do at least two things. One was to be a rebuttal, as it were, of the Condon Report. The Condon Report, of course, had come out in the late 1960s, and it had said that UFOs were not worth studying scientifically. And Sturrock had been very critical of that, and he had always hoped that he could get a group of scientists together to look at the phenomena objectively and reach a different conclusion, which he thought would be justified. So that was the first thing. The second was to present some of the latest UFO evidence to a panel of distinguished scientists to get their advice on the subject, to see how they would react to UFO evidence that the scientific community normally doesn't ever view.
The meeting was held in 1997 to allow the examination of physical evidence presented by people that do research in the UFO field to be examined by people outside the UFO field. And in both cases, these people were scientists receiving the information, presenting it, and then the scientists examining it. And they were selected based on people that could present the actual physical evidence, not stories, not wishful thinking, but evidence of things happening, real photographs, real videos, real medical effects, real ground trace effects, and that sort of thing. And in this field, there's quite a bit of that. It isn't often talked about, often discussed, and Dr. Sturrock thought it would be well to be able to expose this to an independent panel of people that had no interest or no knowledge of the subject, and get their opinion on what could be done or what should be done and how important it was. So that was the reason we met.
There wasn't anything amazing in the reports from the panel. I think the evidence was solid, of course. I was there and presented some of it. I think it was evidence that the phenomenon is anomalous, but there wasn't anything so compelling that, you know, you would read the report and say, oh, why, this is astounding evidence. Why, you know, this really shows that this UFO phenomena is unearthly or alien or can't be explained by science absolutely. You know, no, it was just good, solid UFO evidence.
The scientists gathered at Pocantico concluded that the UFO problem was not simple and was certainly not the result of a general or single phenomenon. The report added that each unexplained observation presented the scientific community with an opportunity to make new discoveries through the study of these phenomena. However, out in the field, the main difficulty in studying UFOs is learning how to pinpoint what's relevant. Over the years, UFO circles have become such a melting pot for all phenomena that it takes a lot of serious research to find any significant proof within UFO reports. Between 1991 and 1994, Nick Pope was tasked by the British government to assess the pile of UFO sightings recorded by their Ministry of Defense. He therefore had ample opportunity to appraise the quality of the statements made by witnesses.
I think it's quite clear that 90 or 95% of UFO sightings are either misidentifications of something quite ordinary, but perhaps seen in unusual viewing conditions, or by a witness who is not familiar with the particular object or phenomenon. But there are these hardcore of cases, and there has been, right from the beginning, of our official investigations in this. And this is as true for the Americans with Project Blue Book as it is for the British. There are these sightings that we can't explain. Good quality sightings. I'm not talking about cases where we have insufficient data. I'm talking about the sorts of cases where we have, say, police or military witnesses or pilots, say, who are seeing solid, structured craft. I'm talking about the cases where things are tracked on radar. I'm talking about cases where Air Force jets have been scrambled to try and intercept these things, and where perhaps we have good photographic or video evidence that has been properly analysed and enhanced. These sorts of cases. And when looking at these cases, I am quite favourably disposed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because when I've eliminated everything else, that seems to be a very real possibility. Can I prove it? No, I can't. We do not have proof. But in my mind, we do have good evidence.
UFO sightings are an undeniable fact, proven by the thousands of statements and recordings that have been submitted. These sightings happen. Explaining them is another thing. Making a broad statement that they're all false or they're all true based on a single explanation seems rather simplistic to me. The truth of the matter remains to be seen. It's true that most cases are false alarms. In our work, we have proven that most cases are the result of an honest error made by the observer, while now and then we see cases where the error was made intentionally or designed as a hoax.
In actual fact, what happens most of the time is that a person comes face to face with something that they do not understand. And they contact the police in the hopes of getting an answer to the mystery. Of all the sightings that are reported, practically none of them turns out to be a hoax. I would say maybe one hoax per 1,000 cases reported.
But for all of the other cases reported, there is no reason why there needs to be one single explanation. The proof is the fact that we're discovering new things every day, like sprites in the upper atmosphere, which we discovered a few years ago. They might explain some of the strange lights seen by aircraft in the sky. So there's certainly a whole gamut of explanation. The extraterrestrial theory is simply a projection based on a desire to believe, and for good reason. If we take a look at aviation files and radar data which seem to show objects displaying intelligent behavior, we're very tempted to believe just that. In actual fact, it's only one possible explanation.
Unfortunately, ufologists usually have nothing more to go on than statements made by witnesses. How valuable are these statements really? Rationalists tend to discard them under the pretext that a statement alone has no inherent value. We must exercise caution in considering these statements, but they are still a valuable source of information. If statements people make are truly of no value, then we might as well shut down the court system. Critics like to point out that when it comes to witnessing a UFO phenomenon, most people are not used to observing phenomena in the sky, even police officers and pilots.
Arguments are always being raised against UFO stories, usually by rationalists, because there's a difference between scientists who work as researchers and rationalists who adamantly oppose any stories of UFOs. Their argument is that astronomers don't see UFOs. If all these things were flying around in the sky, then scientists, especially astronomers, would see them. The problem is that astronomers spot UFOs the same way as everyone else. We know that for a fact. Peter Sturrock, an astrophysicist from Stanford University, did a study back in 1977 which showed just that. Another study showed that 5% of UFO observers were astronomers, so they do see things too. But what does an astronomer actually do? He doesn't look at the whole sky, just like scientists don't look at nature. They look at their instruments. A telescope has a very small field of vision. If an astronomer were to see a UFO, it would only appear in passing like a satellite, a meteorite, or a bird. It would be very rare. They wouldn't have time to focus on the object. It would be gone before they knew it. When they see a meteorite fly by, they don't make anything of it. So astronomers do see strange things in the sky, but not usually while they're working. There's a genuine problem. When UFOs are discussed, some people say that they don't exist. The problem is not whether UFOs exist or not. The problem is that tons of arguments seem to be based on the idea that scientists observe nature, so they should be seeing UFOs. Scientists do not observe nature, they produce facts under laboratory conditions, very specific artificial conditions that do not correspond to the image of science portrayed in popular science magazines.
Most UFO sightings have a perfectly rational explanation. They should not be considered of alien origin until all of the elements involved have been thoroughly analyzed. This analysis stage contains many hidden traps. Although they represent a very small percentage of objects reported, weather balloons can be mistaken for UFOs. Even seasoned observers like civil and military pilots have been fooled by these large silver spheres. Don Ledger, a Canadian civil pilot and co-author of Dark Object, took a keen interest in UFO sightings reported by his colleagues. He is familiar with the most common misinterpretations, like weather balloons, Venus, aircraft, auroras, meteorites, and billow clouds.
Normally, getting off track a bit here, usually large scientific balloons, and they are large. Some of these things are 300 feet across. They're filled with helium, and they're carrying scientific packages. We'll get a NOTAM as a pilot. You'll get a NOTAM with your about every 3 months in the mail from Transport Canada, and it's NOTAM that this thing is going to be lifting off from a certain area, usually up north, where the air is more stable and where they're investigating anyway. And these things will go up 80, 90,000 feet. And as they go up, you've probably seen the older pictures of them. They look long and skinny, almost like a baseball bat, and then they start looking like an ice cream or a parachute. But by the time they get to altitude, they balloon right out because the air pressure is less up there. So they turn into this big, oval, shiny thing because of the makeup of the material, you know, the Kevlar that, or not Kevlar, but the mylar that makes these things up. And can carry up to 4 million cubic feet of helium in there. Right? And they can drift around up in the upper atmospheres for days and days and days, reflecting sunlight. And people will report them, and that's really, they have every right to, because it's quite anomalous looking up there, and it's sparkling away. So they account for some UFO reports and so on.
There aren't that many weather balloons. They're launched in northern Quebec. Winds are predominantly from the west, so don't try to tell me that these supposed weather balloons are traveling from north to south. Okay, now that I've made that perfectly clear, let's drop this whole weather balloon business. Skeptics better come up with a better explanation than that, because according to them, weather balloons are everywhere. All UFOs are weather balloons. Observers have more chance of seeing an aircraft since planes are aluminum and may be painted white, so when the sun is low on the horizon, it can reflect off the cabin. The wings can't be seen, just a fine white line in the sky, so since the object is far away and can't be heard, it can be mistaken for a UFO. Venus is also a possibility. Most people in Quebec travel between Montreal and Quebec City, so they travel east-west on highways 10, 20, and 40, which means they may spot Venus setting in the west. If you see Venus setting in the north, call me, because it isn't Venus. Of all the planets, Venus is the one that is most often mistaken for a UFO. So what I'm saying is that people may be mistaking aircraft and planets for UFOs. That's true, but it's time they stop trying to tell us that people are seeing weather balloons.
In the spring of 2002, a Montreal businessman filmed a curious sight in the sky. It was very early in the morning, and the object showed up clearly against the morning sky. Upon analysis, it was discovered that the object was nothing more than a mail plane arriving at the local airport. At times, the source of confusion is much more simple. Officer Nelson Jean with the Quebec Provincial Police recalls a UFO sighting recorded at his station.
At the time, we were responsible for covering Montérégie, Montreal, Laval, the Laurentians, and Lanaudière. As I recall, it happened near Saint-Julie. People called to report colored lights in the sky. When our police officers arrived at the scene, they traced the lights back to a dance club. Someone was either accidentally or intentionally projecting laser beams into the sky. which was leading people in the area to think that they were seeing something from outer space, perhaps a UFO or a signal from extraterrestrials.
Other than laser beam projectors, aircraft, and weather balloons, we also need to consider objects entering Earth's atmosphere. Orbital debris, which is becoming more and more common. A few years ago, during a similar incident over France, the state police were inundated with calls throughout the country from citizens wishing to report a UFO sighting. At the time, Jean-Jacques Velasco was already heading up the French group CIPRA, which tracks objects entering Earth's atmosphere. It is an agency working for the French National Space Research Center, otherwise known as CNES.
We've noticed that these days, a lot of sightings result from debris falling from objects in orbit. This was the case on November 5, 1990, when we witnessed an amazing display of debris from a Russian rocket. The debris was scattered throughout the skies over Europe, particularly over France.
Films and photographs can be useful tools to ufologists as they try to make heads or tails out of a UFO sighting. But once again, a visual aid in itself does not constitute proof that UFOs are alien in origin. This is true even more so now that new computer technologies allow amateurs to fake photos that look as professional as anything produced in Hollywood.
Well, as you know, I'm quite familiar with the field of photography, since I worked as an expert in this area when I was with CNES. I came to the conclusion that it is one of the most disappointing aspects of UFO cases. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, it's the element that evokes the most emotional response and most expectations from the public. We often hear people say, if only we had a good picture of this, we could check into it further. In actual fact, nothing is further from being solid proof than a single photo on its own. That was true even 15 or 20 years ago. Back then, I received funding to study all the tricks involved in photo analysis. We noticed that some people were very clever at faking photos. Nowadays, with computer technology, anyone can use commercial software to touch up photos. I've had a bet for 10 years that no one can produce a photo able to withstand photo analysis tests. There are two types of photographs of so-called UFOs. There are the cases where the witnesses are in a state of panic over something that they saw, and there's little information available. These pictures are typically a small white light against a dark background, or if taken during the day, the object appears as a small dot in the sky, as was the case in Vrep, France a few years ago, when an object was photographed against a clear blue sky. Even using the most powerful tools possible, the information extracted is minimal. Then there are the photos for which more information is provided. At the other extreme, you have fake photos. They don't pop up as often as you might think, but they still seem to be profitable in some countries. When I traveled in certain southern countries, I noticed that books were being sold with fake photos in them. Generally, they're pretty easy to spot. Then there's a majority of cases where an honest error is made. This happens when a person sees something that appears strange to them, and they take a picture of it only to discover later that it was simply the aurora borealis or some other uneventful occurrence. There are also cases where something odd happens in the camera when a picture is taken. Cases of optical phenomena or cases where something is on the film. I once saw a photo that had me stumped for the longest time until I analyzed the film under a microscope. As far as misinterpretations go with respect to photos or home movies, a lot of people mistake reflections for UFOs. Many people use small camcorders these days, which is great for us UFO researchers, since these films provide us with good visual material to analyze. I'll give you a quick trick for figuring out whether or not your photo or film has a reflection on it. You just need to draw an X across your photo. Take a ruler and draw a light line with a pencil from one corner corner up to the opposite corner. Then do the same with the other two corners. This will give you the center of your picture. If the brightest object in your photo is a reflection, then it will cross the center and keep on going an equal distance in the opposite direction. The reflection can't be anywhere else. The angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence. This is a basic law of physics. People often take pictures through a window or a glass pane, and cameras also have a protective lens covering, which can create reflections when a picture is being taken, like of a street light or of distant car lights. The photographer doesn't see the sources in his reduced field of vision. A car passes by, shines on the lens, and a small lens-shaped reflection appears on the photo. Before you call the press to say that you've just photographed a flying saucer, you should double-check to make sure that there are no reflections in your picture. Only then should you consider that perhaps there really was an object in the sky. If there was an object, then it's time for what I refer to as the investigative process, noting the color of the object and calculating distances and so forth to determine the size and possibly the weight of the object.
At times, the so-called UFO is nothing more than an unidentified optical object. In the early 1990s, there were several sightings of discs with scalloped edges, vaguely reminiscent of the symbol used by the comic book hero Batman. According to the reports, these bat-shaped discs first began to appear over Belgium, before spreading to Spain and then the United States. Unfortunately for mystery lovers, there was nothing exciting behind these UFOs. The image was nothing more than a bright object, such as the moon or a streetlight, filmed out of focus, due to the focus ring on camcorders that had just come out on the market at the time. Speaking of images, Earth is now constantly monitored by a network of satellites. Each day, these spies in the sky take dozens of pictures of the Earth. Why aren't there any satellite images of UFOs?
Another mistake that ufologists often make with respect to satellite images is that they think if UFOs are flying around the Earth, we should see one appear on the satellite image now and then. When they say that, they obviously do not realize that remote sensing satellites circle Earth every 90 minutes at an altitude of 500 to 600 miles. If we look at satellite images, all we see is a bunch of tiny dots on a huge surface. Even if an army of 100 huge UFOs landed on Earth within the space of a few hours, it is highly unlikely that they would be detected by any of the dozens of satellites hovering over Earth.
As we try to identify the unknown, some UFOs defy explanation. At least, it would seem so at first glance. However, just because we can't correctly label an object doesn't mean we should jump to the conclusion that we're being invaded by aliens. Remember, the term UFO does not necessarily mean an interplanetary craft. Jean-Pierre Farabeau was a research engineer working at a physics lab within France's Polytechnical Institute. A few years ago, he wrote a book about unidentified flying weapons.
One possible explanation for UFOs is that they are secret military aircraft. A historian from the CIA even wrote a report claiming that most unexplained UFOs could be attributed to flights by an aircraft referred to as the U-2. Well, it's true that some of the U-2's flight plans did coincide with UFO sightings. But in my opinion, this happened in a very small percentage of cases. There's also the fact that the U-2 was flown for the first time in 1955, whereas UFO sightings began to be reported regularly as of 1947. So the U-2 could certainly be used to explain some of the sightings, especially since it flies at a very high altitude. And it has what you might call a halo effect. Although it is shaped like a glider, glare from the sun's rays may cause it to look circular instead. The fact remains that it appeared in the sky too late to explain the first 8 years of UFO sightings. And there's still the fact that only a few of the U-2's flights correspond to UFO sightings. There were other aircraft built after the U-2 that could have been mistaken for UFOs due to their speed and high flying altitude. They were called blackbirds. Two different aircraft were built that closely resembled each other: the CIA's A-12 and the Air Force's SR-71. But once again, the A-12 was flown for the first time in 1962, so it could not account for any sightings before that time. Naturally, it could account for some of the sightings reported since then.
While engineers at the Lockheed Aviation Corporation were designing the U-2 spy plane, officials in charge of technical development within the U.S. Air Force were already conceiving of an even more ambitious project, named Project Silverbug. Their goal was to build a circular craft capable of vertical liftoff and able to fly at an altitude of 80,000 feet and a speed of Mach 3, or 3 times the speed of sound. Development of Project Silverbug was assigned to engineers at the Canadian firm Avro, which had designed the lightweight Arrow CF-105.
The Avro car was an engineering study by the same company that produced the Arrow, the infamous aircraft that was built by the Canadian government and then eventually canceled. In fact, there is a popular movie about it quite recently starring Dan Aykroyd. At the same time they were producing this jet aircraft, they were producing a circular vehicle that was said to be able to rise up on its own power and fly through the air. A number of other devices like this had been produced, but this was the Canadian government's own attempts. Curiously, midway through the development, it too was canceled.
Unable to rise more than a couple of feet off the ground, the Avro car was a failure. Its instability made it dangerous to fly. In 1961, Project Silverbug was terminated, and one of the only 2 models built is now installed on a pedestal in front of the U.S. Army Transport School in Virginia. Could UFO tales have been inspired by test flights of the Avro car or other secret prototypes with an unusual aerodynamic shape, like the YB-49, or perhaps the V-173, nicknamed the Flying Pancake? Or in more recent years, perhaps UFO observers spotted the B-2 stealth bomber or the F-117A fighter, both of which have an unusual shape. According to rumors, recent UFO sightings could be flights of a secret prototype being built in the legendary Area 51, a triangular craft known by the codename Aurora.
Rumors that the Aurora exists have been spread by a magazine that is generally quite serious in nature, the Aviation Week in Space Technology. An article was published in 1990 in which they stated that there had been more than 40 sightings or telephone confirmations by sources within the military, proving the existence of this aircraft, capable of flying at incredible speeds such as Mach 5 to Mach 8 at extraordinary altitudes, much higher than the blackbirds could fly. I heard a lot about this aircraft. Around 1991, and for a year or 2 afterwards, we heard reports of what were referred to as skyquakes. They were like earthquakes, but they came from the sky. They came from the Pacific coast over California and headed in the direction of Area 51. They would occur every Thursday morning like clockwork. This was rather odd behavior for either a natural phenomenon or extraterrestrial beings. We're not sure why Thursday morning was so important to them. So it seemed to be pretty much of an established fact that it existed, and then we never heard anything more about it. The U.S. Department of Defense formally denied that it existed. We're under the impression that there are sightings of man-made crafts that we should normally be able to explain, but they must be secret military craft, and that's why we can't explain them. But even those don't explain all of the sightings.
There are other phenomena which might help to explain several UFO reports, but they are more difficult to zero in on. There is a whole field of natural phenomena which are mentioned now and then in scientific papers, but remain mysterious and unexplained. Such is the case for seismic lights, or earthquake lights, as they are sometimes called. Lights created by earthquakes. Franz Saint Laurent has taken an interest in this strange phenomenon.
A few UFO reports, and I mean just a few, a very low percentage, can be explained by earthquake lights. But I mean real earthquake lights. As far as I'm concerned, to be earthquake lights, they have to occur during an earthquake or immediately before or after it. There also needs to be a link with tectonic strain. Before an earthquake occurs, there may be a period of months or years during which major forces are at work under the Earth's surface at particular locations. And as this stress builds, it can produce what I call tectonic lights, what others refer to as earth lights.
Well, actually, the interest in luminous phenomena, or UFO reports, began with really an empirical approach. We were looking at we, meaning Ghislaine Lafreniere and I, were looking at the relationship between unusual phenomena, balls of light, unusual animals, and we tried to find out what could be related to them, and we found that earthquakes tend to occur in the same areas. So, as any science would, we pursued that and found out that, sure enough, luminous phenomena throughout the centuries have preceded increases in earthquake activity. Let me address UFO phenomena, which are the balls of light, the unusual colors of lights that inundate, or I should say inundate one's perceptual field, but they show an oscillation. They often look like they're turning, and basically different temperatures reflect different wavelengths and different colors. Those are physical phenomena generated by the Earth itself. Strain within the Earth, stress within the Earth, before earthquakes generate these balls of light. And we know that's correct because in any given area, there's an increase in luminous phenomena before earthquakes occur. The majority of luminous phenomena are tied to imminent earthquake activity, stress and strain within the Earth. And the reason we know that is that in areas where there's a buildup of water, for example in reservoirs, or when people pump water into an area, for example to bury hazardous fluids, there's increases in earthquakes locally and also an increase in luminous phenomena. A very small number of luminous phenomena are associated with people having the experience of contact with an alien or contact with some other entity.
We knew that in order to be seeing what we were seeing, there had to be a very strongly charged electric field producing these luminous displays in the sky. We knew that. Since the 1960s and 1970s, scientists have been trying to discover what causes these earth lights to appear in the sky. They made some discoveries and came up with a few theories. Some scientists researched the lights in a laboratory setting, but what they often found was that their theories only partially explained what was being observed. There were gaps in their theories, but that doesn't matter. That's just normal. After all, they were just starting to research the phenomenon.
Well, one thing we do know is that tectonic strain building up before an earthquake, is distributed along earthquake faults, very often along riverbeds or creek beds, on the top of hills, and a variety of unusual phenomena can be generated. Balls of light are simply one. Also, ultrasound can be generated, which very often rats or dogs can hear. Sometimes odd smells are generated. Sometimes if you have a Peltier phenomena, you get a decrease in temperature locally, or sometimes an increase in spontaneous fires. If you happen to be unfortunate enough to walk through these fields, it's going to stimulate your brain directly. And very often, people experience a haunt. And in our research, we find that wherever you have luminous phenomena showing up, so-called UFO flap, you also have an increase of
all kinds of other parapsychological phenomena. Haunts, poltergeist reports, basically strange things in general become more frequent, including mundane things like more light bulbs burnt out, more alternators in your cars burnt out, cars not starting, more anomalous behavior by humans, for example, more suicidal behaviors from protracted depression. These things often occur in clusters.
Even though research into Earth lights is still in its early stages, some scientists are beginning to find possible explanations. One of these scientists is Friedman Freund, professor of physics at San Jose State University in California.
Purely by accident, I recently came across a scientist who works at San Jose State University in California. He also works for the NASA Ames Research Center. He proposed a theory and created a model to explain how these lights were being produced. I found his theory interesting because it also explained why earthquake lights sometimes do not occur, since we have observed that they don't occur with every earthquake. What is interesting about his theory is that it is based on a discovery that he made several years ago. Below the Earth's surface, among igneous rocks, which form most of the Earth's crust, can be found something called charge carriers. I won't explain the chemistry behind it since it's pretty complicated. So he discovered these charge carriers, which he called positive hole pairs. When there is not much tectonic strain, these charge carriers lie dormant in the rock. On the other hand, when the tectonic strain builds to the point where an earthquake is about to occur, these charge carriers become quite mobile. In his laboratory, Freund calculated that these charge carriers could move as fast as 1,000 feet per second. That's pretty fast. So around the time of an earthquake, we have these charge carriers moving about, spreading throughout the Earth's crust. As these charges move, by definition, each one is a current. In electronics, we call it a hole current. It has a positive charge due to a lack of electrons. When these mobile charges hit the Earth's surface, they generate electromagnetic waves of various wavelengths. They then create a strong electric field at the Earth's surface. Freund calculated that in an ideal setting, for instance at the top of a mountain, the charge could get as high as 1 million volts per centimeter. That's a pretty powerful electric field. Once this electric field is created, it puts a strain on the air, which is normally an insulator. And the air changes from an insulator to a conductor and produces luminous displays in the sky.
One of the conclusions that scientists arrived at during the Pocantico meetings in 1997 was that UFO sightings do not boil down to one single phenomenon. Research by Dr. Michael Persinger at Laurentian University in Sudbury shows that the assessment of these sightings goes beyond a mere "I believe in UFOs" or "I don't believe in UFOs."
One of the lessons we learn in science is that phenomenon such as UFOs, luminous phenomena, that is an over-inclusive label. I'll give you an example. In the late 1800s, the word vapors was used to describe pneumonia, emphysema, tuberculosis, the common cold, and flu as well as cancer. They were all called the vapors because they influence breathing. Now imagine what would have happened if penicillin was developed then and you gave it to people with vapors. Well, only those with pneumonia would have been beneficial, and people would have dismissed penicillin because it did not treat vapors. The problem is the label. It's over-inclusive. And the same thing with the UFO label. It over-includes a lot of strange phenomena. Most of them have very clear natural bases that we know about now, but there's still others we have to be open-minded about. And just because we're open-minded doesn't mean it's never measurable, which means we ultimately can measure it. In the perspective of science, anything is probable. And if we have a phenomenon such as UFOs, or basically luminous phenomena, that's a more appropriate way to describe them, because UFOs is a pejorative label with all kinds of negative connotations. Odd luminous events. Most of them we know from our data analysis, more than 80% are clearly tied to tectonic strain. We're talking about the real ones now, not the misperceptions. Of the remaining 20%, it's hard to tell what the actual natural forces are. And the possibility that there are other phenomena yet to be discovered, including other intelligences, we still must be open-minded to that possibility.
In general, the scientific community is not interested in UFOs. Why? Obviously, there is the ever-present funding problem. What self-respecting financial institution would put its credibility on the line by financing research into UFOs? No funding, no research. But there is a worse problem: prejudice. To most scientists, the logic is quite simple. If UFOs were real, then there would have to be extraterrestrial spaceships. And since interstellar travel is not possible, UFO reports cannot be true. In all research, observation must take precedence over theory. As Robert Leighton, one of the pioneers of modern physics, once said, "If something happens, it's because it's possible for it to happen." But of all the strange cases that defy explanation, how many are really prototypes of secret military aircraft, and how many are really due to natural phenomena as yet unknown? Could the other cases really be visitors from outer space? For now, it's impossible to say for sure. If there's one thing that holds true in the police world, it's that if you want to solve a problem, you must take an interest in it.
We noticed that the science community turned its back on the Pocantico report. We weren't too surprised, since they've always had that attitude where this subject is concerned. I recently did an audit on the CNES Research Center, and along the way I met some prominent scientists from the technical field. I won't name any names, but I was stupefied by what some of them had to say. In their minds, the only things that truly exist in the field of science are things that can be created in a laboratory setting. If the great minds of science in all countries think like this, then we're not about to make much headway in the science of observation. The problem with UFOs is that we don't see them in abundance. We can say the same thing about scientific facts. Who has ever seen a scientific fact? If anyone ever has, I'd like to meet them. It's impossible. Scientific facts are charts, diagrams, and things you read about in magazines. You never hear anyone say, "Look, I just saw a scientific fact." If we take a cloud, for instance, sure, it's a scientific fact, but only because it's been studied. Scientific facts do not appear out of thin air. Apples falling from trees were used to make jam long before they became associated with the law of gravity. Newton had to invent the law of gravity first. By the way, the apple story never even happened. So we have a problem. To become a scientific fact, it must first be placed in the proper context. So the question is, what can we do with these UFO reports to capture the interest of scientists? We need to word the problem differently. Just because it's worded in terms of UFOs doesn't mean that the problem should be discarded completely with the claim that UFOs don't exist. That's simply not reasonable.